Let's move you to this now. Condolences are pouring in for former Reserve Bank Governor and Minister of Finance Titus Mboweni. Now we also speak to former Minister of Finance Trevor Manuel on the passing of Mr. Mboweni. Thank you so much, Mr. Manuel, for your time. Let's get your immediate reaction to the news of the passing of the former Minister Mboweni.
Thank you very much, Mkhalisi, and good morning to all your viewers. Of course, the passing of my friend and comrade Tito Mboweni so suddenly is a deep loss. Tito was always a very special human being. Throughout all the years, from the way in which he embraced me when I first came to Shell House as the ANC headquarters then was, as the head of the Department of Economic Planning, through our joint efforts in a number of efforts. People frequently talk about him as governor, but I think that the groundwork was laid much before that. Tito Mboweni's insights into what went into Ready to Govern, the Reconstruction Development Plan, all preceding our election into government in 1994. And then I think that what we need to acknowledge is the role that he played in labor legislation that benefits lives of working people to this day. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Labor Relations Act, the Employment Equity Act, and then also the establishment of Nedlac, the Nedlac Act. All of those came from the hands and minds of Tito Mboweni and was focused on improving on the quality of life of people, to make democracy real in the lives of people. All of that preceded his tenure as governor of the Reserve Bank, and sometimes you don't quite see what the governor does in quite the same way, but Tito's battle to ensure that we could both attract investment into the country and keep interest rates low in the interest of dealing with the debt of people, the protection of the banks in South Africa, all of those were phenomenally important contributions that Tito made to laying the basis for a better life for all in South Africa. It's a long story, it's a long journey, but I think it's one that we must cherish because his contribution has left an indelible mark in all of our lives. One of the issues that hasn't been spoken about in Mkhalisi is his deep passion for the African continent. Tito Mboweni was part of the institutional reform panel for the African Union, which was chaired by President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. Tito often tweeted about just how good he found things in Rwanda, but it was about understanding the need for institutional reform on the African continent, and was a deep, deep part of his life, a deep part of his commitment, and his frequent travels to Kigali was an expression of that body of work as well. And then he comes back as Minister of Finance later. So it's a long journey, and I think a very sad loss. He hadn't been ill for very long. It was a very sudden departure, and I think a deeply, deeply felt loss.
Indeed, Mr. Manuel. And I want to also just piggyback off your response there, as you spoke to us about your relationship with Mr. Mboweni that spans many years. And the reality is, behind that man who crunched numbers and formulated policy was also quite a humorous character. And I want to hear about that character from you.
Look, there are too many stories to tell. But Tito's humor was the stuff of legend. Whether this comes from stories from exile about how useless he was going to be as a guerrilla, he was much better as an economist than a guerrilla, to some of the quirks, because he was quite a quirky chap. I know that many people relate to his quirkiness from his life in Mahuba's Kloof and his cooking. Of which he told stories and clips on X or Twitter, but all of it is part of this wonderfully humorous, engaging and embracing kind of person. one of the things I always remember about Tito is that he lived a life of complete non-racialism. He didn't see race in people. He always embraced other people, whether this be tomato farmers in Limpopo somewhere, or the poorest of people in an informal settlement elsewhere. Tito was the kind of person whose humor also saw him embracing others. And that, he was just a great person, great South African, and a great leader of people.
And Mr. Manuel, he's also been described as a decisive leader as we continue to hear tributes pouring in throughout the course of the morning. And I can assume that also part of his job was also making decisions that were, viewed as unpopular by some fronts. So he was a decisive leader. Talk to us about him being a decisive leader and some of his legacy policies as well as programs that he implemented.
Look, I referred to the pieces of legislation that go back to his tenure as Minister of Labour. And all of them were driven in quite a hard way. When you say decisive, it's also important to say that Tito was an inclusive leader. He would take the trade union leaders into a hotel for a week and sit with them virtually through the day and night to get those key pieces of legislation, Basic Conditions of Employment Act, Labour Relations Act, across the line. And he knew that if the union leaders were on side with the legislation, then getting it through Parliament was always going to be easy. And so when you say decisive, it wasn't about shutting himself off and taking decisions. It was often about the way in which he reached out and brought other people on board. So that was always a part. It was part of his character, part of his style, and that decisiveness carried him, from the Labour Ministry into the position of Governor of the Reserve Bank. And also the way in which he had to play a role in global institutions, World Bank, the IMF, the G20, all of those required sharp insights and the ability to persuade and decide.
And Mr. Manuel, this is, of course, a man that was the first black governor for the country in 1999, going into 2009. And this is when the country was still transitioning. Talk to us about this and what it actually meant for him, if he'd probably shared it with you at some point.
Police, let me say that we shouldn't make too much of the color of his skin in becoming governor of the Reserve Bank. You can also say he was the first black Minister of Labour. He was the first black this, that, or the other. I don't think that we must overemphasize the race, because I'm saying that one of Tito's standout attributes was his non-racialism. He went into the Reserve Bank initially as an advisor to the former governor, Dr. Chris Stultz. And by the time he became governor in 2009, the groundwork had been very well prepared. So there wasn't a big ruckus about it. But of course, Tito had his own style. And for instance, he would not meet editors for dinner, editors of newspapers for dinner, unless they wore a black tie. It was a quirk. It was a funny thing. The editors were always miffed because they'd have to go and hire tuxedos to have dinner with the governor. But that was Tito. He was quite extraordinary in the way in which he said about things.
And Mr. Manuel, before we let you go, let's just hear about the legacy that he leaves behind.
Look, I touched on those key pieces of legislation. I touched on, before we got into government, the Ready to Govern program, the Reconstruction Development program. All of that was part of the preparation for governance, And I think that legacy is a durable legacy. The issues in the Reserve Bank are transformative, but they're a little more difficult because interest rates change and so on. But in respect of the building of a strong banking system, that'll outlive Tito as part of his legacy. His tenure in the private sector, where he was chair of both AngloGold Ashanti and NAMPAC for a considerable period. And of course, he was also an advisor to the International Investment Bank, Goldman Sachs, right until the very end. He retained that. And when he left to become Minister of Finance, he returned to that position, certainly. All of that will live on, and his contributions to the African continent and to institutional reform on the continent, I think, are also legendary in understanding ourselves as South Africans, but also as Africans, and knowing that we must have appropriate institutions to improve on the lives of our people.
Right, that's former Minister of Finance, Mr. Trevor Manuel, joining us there. Thank you very much indeed for your time on the program. And as tributes continue to pour in, we now speak with Matthew Parks, who's COSATU Parliamentary Coordinator, regarding the passing of former Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. This is to acknowledge Mboweni's significant contributions to the country's economic landscape. And I know that as we continue to also get tributes, this will also go on into the day with our colleagues who will be carrying it forward.